But first, I'm joined on the line by Bill Woodhouse. He's a retired Royal Navy sub-lieutenant who got to know Ted Heath through his boat-building firm. Hi there, Bill, and welcome to the Politics Show.
Hello, Tony.
So tell us, first of all, how you first met Ted Heath.
Well, I met him through sailing. The very early days for Ted Heath sailing, a great aunt had left me a small legacy, just enough to do what I'd always wanted to do, which to commission my own racing dinghy. And it was due to be finished just before the London Boat Show. And in fact, I dithered whether to have 10 days exposed to all the dust and everything. But in the end, I decided that Jack Chippendale, who was the builder, would probably make an even better job than he usually did. He always made a wonderful job. And it also is interesting because the first time dinghies were the bottom floor of Earl's Court, not up on the mezzanine, and they were able to have their sails up. And I'd commissioned Banks to make my sails, and when he heard they were going on show at the Earl's Court Boat Show, he made 3 suits of sails, for he was happy with them, so perhaps I made the right choice. Anyway, I at that time was running Aston Martin to go on to the service depot, and I couldn't get down to see my lovely new boat until Saturday afternoon. And I arrived, and a friend spotted me and said, "Tell that man there behind the sail to take his sticky paws off your lovely new varnish." So I walked round the stern of the boat, and there was Ted Heath. And he was talking to Jack Chippendale, asking all sorts of questions. Why was this there? Why was that there? And Jack Chippendale was delighted to see me, because he didn't know quite some of the fittings I'd specified. And so we had a long chat, and he was quite knowledgeable. At the time, he was sailing snipes, or broadstairs, with a rather nice young man, possibly a boyfriend, I'm not sure about that. And we chatted for a long time, and then Peter Bateman wandered up. He was the current world champion. And so I introduced him to Ted Heath, and I said, "Ted, this is Peter Bateman, current world champion." And I was dropped like a hot brick. The arm went round Peter Bateman, and he said, "Right, let's go and have a beer at the bar, and we talk tactics," which was quite funny. But we kept in touch, and when I eventually became chairman of the Fireball Association, we had European Championships at Hayling Island. And I asked Ted if he'd come down and give the prizes away at the end of the championships, which was very good of him in a way, because it meant missing the last day of Wimbledon. But he came down, and I was out on the water assistant race officer. And when I came ashore, I rushed up to the bar to greet Ted, because someone had said he'd arrived. And he was at the bar looking like a stuffed dummy. He was absolutely motionless, no expression on his face at all, holding half a pint of beer. And Terry Lees of Dunhill was trying to entertain him. Dunhill were lending us a lovely starting boat. And my association secretary was also trying to keep him happy. And I wandered up and I was introduced, and so I got a sort of little bit of a smile. And I thought, well, I've got to find something to interest him. So I said, "Morning Cloud the Third that you're building, why have you gone away from wheel steering and gone back to a rudder?" And that woke him up. He then became quite lively. Having had a little chat about Morning Cloud the Third, which was under build, he then went back to being his sort of stuffed dummy again. And then the wives came up and were introduced. He sort of a glazed look as they all went past, and sort of a little handshake. And I said, "Oh, that's my wife, Ted." So she got a second look. I definitely got the impression he did not like women very much. So anyway, as I say, we kept in touch, and I got to know him reasonably well, but undoubtedly he was a very strange man.
What about his days at Balliol College? Because I understand that there was rumours, anyway, of some kind of scandal cover-up there.
Well, yes, there were all sorts of rumours, and some of them, I think there's got to be grounds for some of them, because when he was at Balliol, Oxford, he apparently got found out doing something rather indiscreet. I think it was possibly a boyfriend, found out by the proctors. And apparently, the story goes that the German DVD found out about this, and he was really being blackmailed by them for the rest of his life. Certainly, he, with, I think, the boyfriend he had at Balliol, he went through Germany in 1939 on a camping holiday.
Well, hang on a minute, because that's, I think you're referring there to Madron Seligman, because this is after the scandal at Balliol. He then went off camping, which is, it's almost unbelievable to think that just at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, Ted would go off camping in Nazi Germany.
Well, indeed, quite apart from which, the Nazis were not very keen on two young men sharing a tent anyway. But they obviously turned a blind eye there. And right up, must have been August, when the Germans were building up, ready to invade over the frontier. The frontier was practically closed to everybody, but he and Seligman were allowed through to go to Warsaw. Now, what on earth they were doing in Warsaw, one does not know, but it was very strange. And then they were allowed back again. And they must have seen all this build-up of tanks and God knows what. Because
sorry, hang on a second there, Bill, because when you say they were allowed back, do you mean they were allowed back into Nazi Germany after being in Warsaw?
Indeed, they were, having been to Warsaw. I mean, that's an absolute fact. And, it does raise questions. What on earth was going on? And then when war broke out, he enlisted, of course, like everybody else, and his first appointment was to an anti-aircraft regiment up at Liverpool. And there were stories that the Germans were aware of all the convoy movements in and out of Liverpool. So again, the finger rather points to perhaps Edward being blackmailed by the DVD. Very strange indeed.
But when you got to know him socially, I mean, you've said he would sort of be quite sort of motionless and that kind of thing. How was he socially?
Well, extraordinary. As I say, he was like a dead lamp bulb. And if you found something interesting in him, he'd, like a switch, he'd turn it on and come alight. When he gave the prizes away at the end of the European Championships, having been this sort of stuffed dummy at the bar, he came into the room and he lit up and he was absolutely brilliant. He charmed all these Norwegians, French, Spanish, Danish sailors, all fairly young men, said how wonderful they were. He wished that he could have them crowing in morning cloud, and they all loved it. So, I mean, he could just turn it on, but when he wasn't interested, he went completely blank.
Was he a sailor, Bill? Was he a sailor? Because I know he became very famous for his morning cloud and all that. Was he actually a sailor himself?
That he ordered. He was ordering it actually while I was with him at the London Boat Show, and he got it delivered that summer, and he simply could not manage it. He spent his whole time capsizing, and because he was then a very senior politician, of course, he had a security guards, two of them, who used to follow in a motorboat. And he capsized so often that they eventually said, "Sir, you've got to give this up, because one day we won't get you before you've drowned yourself." And that's when he took up big boats. The question really is, how on earth did the son of a fairly small builder in Broadstairs ever find the money? I mean, he got obviously parliamentary salary, but that wasn't that much money to build an ocean racer, which was certainly an expensive game. But somehow he did. And I got to know, because most of the people who sailed with him were recruited from Poole Harbour, and I was at Parkson Yacht Club, nearly all the people who sailed with him. And I think he was probably a very good tactician, but he was an absolutely useless helmsman. They would never let him touch the helm before the start of the race until the race was over, and then they let him take the helm for publicity photographs. But I think he was a very good organizer, and in some ways, obviously, a very capable man, but he was a hopeless sailor. Hands-on sailor, that is.
Now, what about rumours that he was actually being paid by the Chinese? I think something like £200,000 a year. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
He went to China, as I think we all know, and was given a panda. And from then on, he was paid $212,000 a year. $212,000, quite a lot of money, to be the Chinese PR man. Well, for the sake of argument, PR, public relations. $212,000 a year until the day he died.
What are your thoughts about the press reports over the last couple of weeks then about him being investigated for child sexual abuse? You obviously don't know the details, but what are your thoughts about those that have emerged and how that affects what we now know about who was the man who was Prime Minister in the 1960s and 1974, particularly 1974 when we entered the European Union?
Well, indeed. And again, one wonders what pressures he was under to do that. Did he really believe in it? I had quite a lot of correspondence with him after that. And in one letter he wrote to me, he said, some people are calling me a traitor. Now, how can I be a traitor in my war record? And I rather cheekily wrote back and said, well, of course, Paquelin had a wonderful First World War record, the siege of Verdun and so on. And look what he did when the Germans invaded in 1940. He collaborated with them. And he wrote back and said, don't you dare compare me with Paquelin, which was I found rather interesting. So yes, I didn't know him that well, but I definitely got the impression he did not like women. I think there was one woman he did quite like, who was married to a good friend of his. So he was definitely a very odd character.
And what about apparently some kind of boating? I think it was an Olympic champion that he managed to get him so that he wasn't given an award of some sort. I think it was either MBE or OBE or something like that too.
Oh well, yes, that's another thing, because I have a very good friend in Rodney Pattison who won gold 3 times and a silver in the Flying Dutchman, and probably would have won the 4th gold if we hadn't pulled out of the Italian races. The government pulled out of the Italian races when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And anyway, when Rodney won another gold at Kiel in the Flying Dutchman, on the last day, they had to be on the water for 2 races back-to-back because weather had meant they'd missed a race, and to make the series they had to have these 2 races. So they had a very long day and came in very tired and rather without any grub. I think they had a few Kit Kats and things with them. And in those days, the Kiel Yacht Club was still run by the Royal Navy. So they went, changed, had a shower, came up to the wardroom, and they were given the typical naval strong gin and tonic. And Rodney's crew, it rather went to his head. He got just a tiny bit tipsy, which is not surprising. An almost empty tummy. And Edward Heath arrived completely unexpectedly. He effectively gate-crashed the prize giving. And he was introduced, of course, to everybody. And Rodney introduced, because Rodney knew Ted quite well, introduced his crew to him. And his crew said, "Hello, Teddy. Fancy seeing you here." And Edward took the most appalling umbrage at this. He didn't like to be addressed like that. And he wrote to whoever it was to say, this man is not to be given an MBE, which was very odd because Harold Wilson had decreed that all crews of winning boats would be given an MBE, both the helmsman and the crew, or however many there were. And this is the only man who was never given an MBE. Now, Rodney's been trying for years to right that wrong without success. Most extraordinary.
What about the child abuse scandal more generally? Because this is almost a very, very serious problem racking the nation, Bill. Is there any thoughts that you've got about what needs to be done? Because it's quite clear that certain very, very powerful people have been involved in this and are still covering it up to this day.
Well, that is very true indeed. If anything did go on, it was probably when he had his flat at the Albany. But I wouldn't think it was children. I really wouldn't. But he did, I think, have a bit of an aptitude for pretty boys.
What about more generally in the country, though? What needs to be done about this scandal? Because it seems to be dragging on and on, Bill, with no resolution, and the powerful are just protecting themselves.
Well, yes. Is it worth police time having a witch hunt on things that have happened? But, of course, I mean, it was terrible. I mean, Jimmy Savile, we know. But a lot of people did know at the time. And there's no doubt that Dolphin Square, which I stayed there once or twice with a girlfriend whose father had a flat there, and there's no doubt that some pretty odd things went on in Dolphin Square. But from what I know of Edward Heath, I don't think he would have molested children. But as I say, I wouldn't say he didn't have a few little boyfriends.
I know you're a member of the UK Independence Party. What are your thoughts, Bill, about what needs to happen with modern Britain, and what's been the effect of joining the European Union? Actually, it was Ted Heath that took us into the EEC, wasn't it?
It was indeed. And what's more, what is so bad about that, he said he would not do so without the full support of Parliament and the full support of the people. Well, the people were never consulted, and Parliament was so against it that the two soldiers were voted against the ECA 72, European Communities Act of 1972. It was rejected twice, and in the end, Ted made it a vote of confidence in his government. Well, now that is really putting MPs on the spot, because if they vote against it, the government's going to fall. And by that, he won by 9 votes. So we were taken in to the European Economic Community then was, which was quite different from what the EU is now, on 9 votes on a vote of confidence in the government. I mean, I think that, frankly, is utterly disgraceful. But at the time, I was actually rather for it, because I was selling an awful lot of watches to places like Sweden, who were EPTA, and they were a pain in the neck. You had to have all these customs forms and take them to the nearest Chamber of Commerce, waste half a day doing it, and get them stamped. And so when we had the referendum in 75, I'm ashamed to say I voted for it, because I thought that the EEC, the European Economic Community, the common market we were told it was, no loss of sovereignty. Now that brings me to another thing. No loss of sovereignty. Edward was sent a letter by his Attorney General which laid out in great detail the enormous loss of sovereignty that would be involved with ECA 72. He was in his office when the letter was delivered, and Thornycroft was the only man with him in his private office. And Ted opened the letter, read it, and went as white as a sheet, and then folded it up, put it in his pocket, and said to Thornycroft, "No one must know about this, not even the cabinet." I mean, it was disgraceful the way we were taking it into the EEC. And then, of course, at Maastricht, when it became quite obvious it wasn't going to be the common market anymore, it was going to be the European Union, we should have had a referendum then. I think we've been treated disgracefully by our politicians over this issue. And, of course, it doesn't have anything much to do with Ted Heath's sexual predications, but, he was quite capable of obscuring facts and telling downright lies that there'd be no loss of sovereignty. He knew perfectly well we would lose enormous sovereignty. Well, we'd lose control of our country. Our laws are not made by elected politicians anymore. They are made by unelected, self-appointed apparatchiks. Most people don't even know who they are. And they're not discussed. They're all made in secret. They're then presented to the European Parliament, who have to rubber stamp them. Nowadays it has changed. If they don't like a law, they can send it back. And if it's presented a week later, they have to pass it.
Well, Bill Woodhouse, fascinating talking to you from down in Dorsetshire, I think, aren't you?
Yes, I am, right in the middle. Lovely part of the world.
Thanks very much for joining us on the Politics Show tonight.
Well, Tony, have I answered your questions?
You certainly have, thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Okay, bye then.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.